Look, I don't mind the occasional road trip. But when you're driving home from work after a long day and the ride takes half an hour, you just want to be home relaxing, not being held up in traffic, getting into a fender bender, let alone being eaten alive by that strange creature that ran you off the road. Today I have some very creepy, unexplained creatures seen while driving. Enjoy, and be sure to submit your story at darkstories.org for a chance to have it narrated. I'm looking for stories about scary things that happened in the mist. Now, let's begin. Driving home from work, from naughtyilluminati. When you work an hour away from home, it's quite a pain to have to drive 2 hours a day, an hour there and an hour back. You end up getting used to it. For me, I usually play some podcasts or music, distracting myself as my mind is on autopilot. I work at a call center in Georgia. I work the old 9 to 5, which again is more like 8 to 6 for me thanks to my long drive. But because the job pays well and I own my own home, then that's perfectly fine to me. Now, this drive takes me to several miles of farmland and field. It's some really pleasant scenery, but it was during this stretch of road, the part that I always thought was the most peaceful, that something horrific happened to me. So I left work at around 5:15 p.m., having to stay a few more minutes late due to an irate customer I was on the phone with. This happens quite a lot, as you could probably guess, at call centers. That workday was a bit more bearable though, as it was a Friday. I had a whole weekend to look forward to, as well as some fun plans with friends that my wife and I had been scheduling for the last month. I clock out, say my goodbyes, then get in my car. I'm driving for about 20 minutes, playing some classic rock but just thinking about my day. It's funny how long stress can stay with you, even though it doesn't matter anymore. As I hit that stretch of road surrounded by fields and farmland, I received a call from my wife. She wanted to go over the plans with friends tomorrow, so that we wouldn't be late, we knew what to wear, where to show up, and all that jazz. She's the kind of person that, even though we've gone over something several times, she'll go over it with you several more times. I kinda like it. It's nice to have someone to make sure you're prepared. We talked for about 10 minutes straight. Glancing out the window, I saw that I was passing by rows upon rows of corn or something. The sun was going down in the distance, and it was quite beautiful. I looked back in front of me, just in time to slam on my brakes as I nearly ran over some person. Before my wife even knew that something was going on my end, the phone was thrown from my hands by the sudden stopping force, smacking into the windshield. I came to a complete stop, nearly hitting my forehead on the steering wheel. "Christ," I muttered, praying that I hadn't hit someone. I rubbed my head and got my wits about me as the car idled on the side of the road to the right. I went straight for my phone with my foot still on the brake. The glass of the windshield where it had hit was perfectly fine, but my phone's screen had all but shattered. The screen was now completely black. There was no call or sound on the other end either. I couldn't get it to turn back on, so it was basically dead. Great, I thought. Talk about making a bad situation worse. If someone was hurt, I wouldn't be able to call 911. I then quickly glanced out of every window, trying to find the person that I nearly hit. I didn't see anyone. Then again, it was getting darker by the second. The sky was a dark purple and blue at this point, and in moments it would be completely dark. Still, I didn't see anyone around me. Maybe I'd spooked them, just as they spooked me, and just ran off. I wanted to get out of the car and be perfectly sure, but when my headlights automatically came on from the dimming sun, I quickly found who ran out in front of me. They were nude, and there were scars all over their skin. And the weird thing about this was that this nude person didn't have any defining features, not even any gender-identifying features on their body. And before long, I realized what I was looking at in the middle of the road ahead of me was the partially illuminated right side of something that wasn't human. There's no way they could be human. I let off the brake and turned on the steering wheel to the left a bit, aligning my car to the center of the road. Then I got a full, good look at it. For the entire duration that I stared at this figure, I couldn't breathe. It was like I forgot how to for a moment. Nothing I was looking at made sense. From head to toe, this thing was human in shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, torso, it was all there, but it wasn't right. Imagine taking a nude photo of a person and then using the smudge tool on Photoshop. That's what it reminded me of. Its flesh was just all sagging skin and scars, and when I finally looked at its face, I was even more terrified than I thought I could be. It didn't have eyes or nose, I don't think. All that was on its face was 2 diagonal slits and a mouth. The thing sort of twitched and stayed put. During this time that I was horrified of what I was looking at, I was desperately trying to make sense of it, and I even had the thought in my head that maybe I did hit the person, and they came out looking like that. But that's stupid. I know how stupid it sounds now. But being scared, being worried like that, it can do things to your head. As I was still moments away from realizing that I should get out of there or call for help, this creature made the first move, and what a move it was. It took off on 2 legs at such high speed that I lost sight of it almost immediately. It ran off to my right, and I thought that it ran off into one of these fields. I quickly found myself glancing out the windows trying to locate it again, because when you see something that horrifying, you want to keep your eyes on it. You never want to lose track of that spider in your room. But soon I heard something instead of seeing it. The sound of my passenger side door being opened. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, too scared to look over to see if someone got inside. I don't think they did, because I heard the door slam shut from the force of me flooring it. But I also heard something dragging on the road outside. Whatever had grabbed the door was still holding on to it. I began to swerve left and right. I nearly swerved off the road and crashed into a ditch, but I managed to shake whatever was holding on to the door. With a thud and a scrape, the dragging sound stopped. I looked in my rear view and saw the thing standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. I never saw it get up. It was just fast and twitchy like that. I sped off down the road, going twice the speed limit to get home. I made it home quickly, arriving to a very distressed wife. I told her everything that happened, even though I'm not sure she believed it all. Even she was worried that I simply hit someone and mistook their appearance or something. I assured her that it wasn't that. Whoever was on the road I had not hit. I knew that for a fact now that my head was clear. No accident occurred, but I definitely saw something that defied reality. Something that gave me nightmares for months on end. From that day forward, I didn't use that route to go to work or to go home. There was an alternate route that increased my drive there and back by about 20 to 30 minutes. That sucked, but I'd rather avoid ever having to see something like that again. Silent Hill creature thing in the fields of Georgia. Please leave me be. The Longest Wait, from 82 Karen. My husband and I are a couple of retired 60-somethings living in British Columbia, Canada. We enjoy long drives and visiting family as often as we can. I'm the one usually doing the driving, while my husband falls asleep in the other seat. 2 years back, we went to a family get-together. This took us a couple of hours into wooded mountains, where my grandson's cabin was located. We get together at this cabin every now and then, so getting there really isn't the problem. It's our car, which is in worse shape than we are. We've been driving this 96 Ford Taurus with over 320,000 miles for years. It's never let us down before, probably because my husband took good care of it. But it was getting up there in miles and years. It was going to break down sooner or later. I'd been telling him that, but he refused to listen. And wouldn't you know it, on our way to the cabin, it did just that. It left us stranded on the side of a wooded mountain road in the middle of the night. I think it was 8:20 p.m. Can't be exactly sure. All I know is that it was dark. My husband was tired and ready for another nap, which he settled in for after contacting the local tow company. Luckily, our BCAA would cover it, but it would be 45 minutes before the tow could come. Considering it would take about 60 minutes for someone from my grandson's house to come get us, we just waited for the tow. The tow company would get us closer to my grandson anyway, so I let them know not to bother coming to rescue us, that we'd be up there and just a little late. You may be wondering why it's so late. I forgot to mention that we would be spending the night that weekend. Our family get-togethers are often multiple nights, not just one. Anyway, we were sitting in the car just trying to keep ourselves distracted. My husband was soon snoring in the other seat, while I was flicking through the pages of a home decoration magazine. The dome lights were still functioning, luckily for me. Otherwise, I'd be crazy bored, and a bit creeped out. For as long as I lived in British Columbia, deep woods, especially dark deep woods like this, have always been eerie to me. Trees hide things, and so does the dark. When you put those things together, in my mind, anything could be out there. Sadly, this idea was confirmed to me that very night. After waiting about half an hour, I heard something to the left where the road would be. I thought maybe a car was coming up in the distance, or maybe some woodland critters were about to cross the road. When I looked over, I didn't see anything. I stared out the window for a while before that whole feeling creeped out in the woods thing kicked in, so I soon went back to reading. I read for a few more minutes before I heard something else coming from the same side of the car. I glanced over. I screamed. I screamed loud enough to freak out what was out there, as well as my husband. When I turned to look out the window, there was something leaning up against it. What I saw was a big hairy claw pressed up against the window and a long canine-like snout sniffing the edge of the window. When I screamed, it jumped back away from the car. I then got a pretty good look at it thanks to the full moon. To be honest with you, I thought it was a bear at first. I had a lovely time feeding a bear by hand once. This was at a zoo I went to that I remember as a child. I clearly remember what bears looked like and how they moved and walked. So my theory that this creature was a bear was soon tossed right out the window. It stood on two legs for far too long, and when it began to walk a bit, it was far too graceful and walked more like a person. It had the features of a wolf. Pointed ears, shaggy fur, canine snout. But when it walked, it had its hands sort of in front of its body facing each other, palms open. It didn't swing its arms back and forth like a person would. Its legs were thick, and they had one extra joint compared to a person's. I was startled once again when I heard behind me, "What in God's name?" It was my husband, who was wide awake and staring at the same odd scene as I. I reprimanded him for startling me, and then looked back at the creature, who was starting to walk around the car. From the look on its face, it appeared to be more curious than anything. Maybe a bit cautious too. But who wouldn't be? Maybe it had never seen a car up close before. Watching it walk around was really bizarre. Seriously, it walked like a person. Walking was second nature to it. Seeing something walk on two legs that isn't a person is a really creepy experience. An experience I wish, and also didn't wish, other people could experience. As it's walking, all the while, it's staring into the car at us. Again, I was sure it was being curious, but being looked at by something far bigger than me like that, it was very spooky. It got up real close to the car again, and began to rake its claws across the top of it. That disgusting sound made me feel like my ears were going to bleed. It stopped doing that after a few moments, then got low to the ground, low enough that it was below the windows of the car, and it started to tug at the handle of the back passenger door. The entire car was locked, so I wasn't as worried as I could have been, but I was starting to think that this thing really wanted inside the car with us. My husband, beginning to panic, leans over and presses on the horn. The creature once more jumps and goes back toward the road, a spot that I think it felt safe at for whatever reason. Still, it's walking on two legs, never once trying to go on all fours like you'd expect any animal to. I think that spooked it enough though, because it turned around and walked away to the opposite side of the road and disappeared into the woods. By then, it was right about time for our tow guy to get here, and after a couple of minutes, he arrived, though I wished he would have arrived early enough to see that thing. Though my husband and I had both seen it, it would have been nice if we had some confirmation from a stranger or a third party. The entire time this happened, it felt like time had slowed down. It was definitely the longest I felt I ever waited for anything. We made it to my grandson's quite late, but I'll be darned if we didn't have quite the story to tell. One that might be a bit too unbelievable for them. What I saw as a police officer. From Anonymous. I work as a cop. A couple of years ago, I was often working nights in a patrol car, setting up speed traps at the local racing intersection, and responding to any late-night calls. This being middle of nowhere, Tennessee, not a lot happened. This particular incident happened on a night where my only call was a domestic dispute out in the country. We were always getting domestic dispute calls from this couple out there. A couple of married farmers that didn't belong together but didn't get the hint. They'd been married 20 years, but fought nightly, and they didn't pay peace of mind to their neighbors who lived actually quite close to them. It was pretty irritating. The husband drank a little too much and had a temper, but his wife had an even bigger temper, one that didn't need to hide below some alcohol. Even still, after leaving that call that night, I couldn't be sure if I was more sorry for him or for her, but in the end I just felt sorry for myself. Their home was located on an old country highway, one of those old long roads that used to be a heavily traveled highway, but now is nothing more than a glorified dirt road, now that the gravel was beginning to crumble. It was in such bad shape that you didn't want to drive more than 25 going through it. Luckily, the surrounding area was quite serene, so it wasn't so bad when you had to stick around longer than you had to out there. After the call was done and I was heading out, I was driving down this old road. Must have been driving 10 minutes or so, when I spotted a broken down vehicle on the side of the road. I'd come in from a different direction, so I wouldn't have seen this car until now. And considering this particular section of the road was pretty heavily traveled during the weekdays by commercial vehicles and loggers, it was something that needed to be dealt with. And yeah, I know how it sounds. It was an old torn-apart highway, but it was still quite well traveled by people who worked out here, and there were quite a few of them at that. Anyway, this sucker was going to need a windshield tag, so I got out of the car with my torch, and I began to circle the vehicle, shining my lights inside of it to make sure no one was in there. It was empty and seemingly abandoned, and there wasn't a tag in the window yet. So I began to write it up. I was going to have this vehicle towed in the next few days if no one came to get it. At least then it would be out of the way and not a hazard. As I'm filling out the tag, it starts. The ground begins to shake a bit in a sort of pattern. The thing it immediately reminded me of, and this is going to sound silly, sure, but Jurassic Park, where the T-Rex is walking in the distance and it causes the cup to vibrate with each step. It was like that in a way. After a couple of these vibrations, I was beginning to freak out. And then there was a sound of something shifting within the trees to the left of me, just beyond where the car was abandoned. I shone my torch in that direction, but I didn't see anything at first, just trees. And then those vibrating footsteps continued, and I could see faint movement beyond the shadows. My knees grew weak, and I realized I was scared. I quickly reminded myself that I had a gun in case something bad did happen, but that didn't comfort me as much as it should have. I found myself backpedaling toward my police cruiser. The footsteps were massive. Whatever they were coming from was extremely heavy and quite slow, but I could tell it was moving, getting closer. As I stood there, leaning against the police cruiser and trembling, I watched a colossal, slow figure move from the left side of the road to the right. The whole time I was shining my torchlight at it, only able to shine one part of the enormous thing at a time. I could see hair at first, long wavy hair that looked dirty and matted, a bit damp too. I then saw short legs that ended in awkwardly shaped feet with nails that curled inward. Then I peered towards its face. Its face reminded me of a mix between a brown bear and a sloth. But the problem with that is, the entirety of this thing was too big. Take the biggest brown bear you've ever seen and multiply it by 4 and you might have something that big. This thing was so huge, it looked as if it could tear one of the oak trees nearby right out of the ground and use it as a back scratcher. I've heard plenty of stories of Bigfoot, aliens and crap. All these weird creatures that are creepy or they're kind of bigger than you that you don't want to see in the woods. But I've never, ever heard tales of something this big. It made sense. I mean, if something like this lived in the woods, it would be easily found, or so you'd think. In a couple of behemoth-sized steps, it was already across the road. Though it was slow for its size, I'm not sure I could keep up with it, with how big it was. I'm standing there, wondering what I should do. Do you call things like this in? I mean, you wouldn't call in the fact that you just encountered a deer. It's wildlife, right? I didn't know what to do at all. Besides, if I did call it in, how would dispatch take that or respond to it? Suddenly, my legs stopped trembling, and I found a source of motivation within me. One that I didn't think I'd have. I was curious. Terrified, sure, but I was curious. Latching on harder to my torch, I ran into the woods following the trail of this thing. I ran off into the woods, trying to get a better look at it. The amount of distance it had already covered between the trees was astounding. The trees weren't especially thick in this area. When something did get in its way, it was sure to bend them out of the way, though it seemed to be careful not to break any. That was odd. There must have been a reason for that. I ran for several minutes, but I was never able to catch up to it, though its footprints were very obviously there, though they looked more like a trail than prints, like it was dragging its back feet instead of raising them. I was out of breath after a while, and I decided to head back. I didn't want to leave my police cruiser alone. I then thought that maybe the camera on the cruiser would have caught this thing in action, but sadly the cruiser was facing at such an angle that all it really captured was me riding up a windshield tag next to that abandoned car on the shoulder. I sat in the cruiser for a while, thinking about what had just happened, wondering what I was going to say to my colleagues. I even took pictures of its trail, but I ended up recycling that phone later on, so I don't have a picture to show here. I did show it to some friends, who simply said it could have been an ATV or a tractor or something. And so far, no matter who I've told, they don't believe my story. And instead of finishing up my windshield tag, I ended up letting someone else do it later the next day. I was kinda creeped out by that area. I was sure that that creature wasn't hostile, but I didn't want to know what it felt like to be squished or flattened by that creature by accident, which I'm sure has happened to some unsuspecting deer or wildlife. With something that big, you'd be nothing more than a cricket. That's not the end of this story. Maybe the end to my story, but I ended up getting some more information from someone who encountered something weird in the same region. I knew this lady who worked for the Forest Service. We chatted for a while whenever we came into contact with each other. She always had a lot of fun stories to tell about her time on the job, but this one in particular was quite interesting to me, because I'm sure that my experience has something to do with hers. She had gotten reports of illegal logging going on in the woods over there. When she showed up, she definitely saw signs of something going on, but instead of finding traces of human logging, what she saw were branches torn asunder from trees. Some trees ripped out of the ground, partially eaten and chewed, and she swears that whatever chewed up these trees and pulled them out would had to have been huge to leave bite marks that big. And whatever did that was also peeling leaves off the trees with ease. There were healthy trees out there, completely scraped and void of leaves. Dozens of them were found like that. Whoever reported this had said that they had heard sounds like trees breaking and being cut down in the middle of the night. That's why they thought it was illegal logging. After hearing this story, and considering my own experience, there was only one thing I knew of that could do that was big enough to leave teeth marks that big enough to strip clean leaves from trees. But I don't know what to call it. I don't even know what it is. But I guess it's good to know that it's an herbivore. So I guess you're perfectly fine, as long as you don't piss it off or accidentally step under its walking path. If you have any ideas as to what this creature could be, let me know. In the meantime, I'm going to try not to think about how sharing the fate that those trees did would be terrible. Don't get out of your car. If you see something weird on the road, if there's something following you as you drive down the highway and it's not another car, just don't get out. Don't slow down, because if you do, you basically have a death wish. So be smart and drive safe, and keep those doors locked and windows rolled up. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own and you want to hear it narrated, the first thing you gotta do is share it with us at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear your scary experiences about creepy things that happened in the mist or fog. If you want to support the show, you can check the links in the description. There's a link to my Patreon where you can donate and help us stay afloat. And there's a link to my merch store where you can get some creepy shirts and stuff. Well, I'll catch you next time. Don't worry, you won't have to wait too long for more scary stories. Till then, here are the credits to my amazing patrons. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.